Hello, the Great Canadian Bagger here, coming to you with a video on the Noblesse Oblige. I will just put a quick caveat at the start of the video today. There is really no fancy visuals. Don't have the time this week, but most of my videos are not very fancy visuals, and they're mostly podcasts. So, I hope that doesn't bother anyone. If it does really bother you, comment below. Future videos, when I have more time, will have better visuals. Albeit, that might just be maps. Anyways, the topic of the video. The concept of the Noblesse Oblige is key to understanding the rationale behind the classical aristocracy. Now, you might remember from a couple weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago now, my last video in the Understanding Politics series, we covered what is feudalism. Now, one of the core things of what is feudalism, of my description of this and explaining the system, what actually makes up feudalism, is the central tenet of obligation. Everyone has an obligation to people above them and below them. The Noblesse Oblige is really just a term specifically made for the obligations of the nobility. It originates from France, and it is best translated as nobility obliges. I think you can see where the translation comes from. It's pretty the words are pretty similar in English and French. And the idea of the concept is that the nobility has a social obligation to do something to help those below them and lower social classes. If you recall, in that video, I gave context that for example, a baron has to protect and provide for his tenants. If they need a mill, he will fund the construction of a new one. If they need a new doctor, he will hire one. Now, of course, not all lords lived up to this obligation, but that was generally seen as a social failure and a demerit for the person, a negative to their personality. Now, this might seem to denigrate the idea behind the Noblesse Oblige, that it's just another obligation akin to the peasantry paying taxes or providing corvée labor, or the noble's obligation to the king to fight in his army. But that's not true. Now, de jure, it is true. They are all the same weight. Every obligation in a feudal society is equal to every other obligation. But when you start talking about the structure of the society, when you're talking about the idea behind the society, what holds it together, both economically and socially, in a feudal society, the Noblesse Oblige runs paramount. It is the most important secular obligation. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is the one obligation that actually holds the entire system together. The expectation that great lords with all of their wealth and privileges had to genuinely care for the well-being of those underneath them was the main and principal reason that kept and enabled feudalism to persist for so long. Because keep in mind, even in the context of that original video, we're talking 900 to 1500, that's 600 years. No societal structure since then has lasted 600 years. In fact, if we really want to push feudalism as a social structure and not a political structure, because feudalism as a political structure really starts fading away in the 16th century. But as a social structure, it continues up until the 18th or 19th centuries, depending on which country you're in. And as a financial structure, there are some places that hold on to it until the 20th century, albeit small outgoes. Sorry, I mixed up social and economic there. Just flip those two in your mind. Social continued up until the 20th century in some places. Economic continued up until the 18th or 19th in most of Europe. But politically, it really is the 16th century when it ends. But the reason why it held together socially and economically for so long is the Noblesse Oblige. So you might ask, what happened to it if it worked so well? If this concept and this obligation facilitated the social structure of feudalism persisting for hundreds and hundreds of years after the political structure failed, why did it go away? Why are we not talking about this today? Well, this is very complicated because it gets really... The root of this question is actually why feudalism disappeared. Why did it get replaced by mercantilism and then later capitalism as an economic system? As a political system, why did it get replaced by absolutism and then constitutional monarchy, democracy, etc.? Why did that happen? And socially, it's even harder to describe. I don't even really know what you would call the modern social dynamic in an easy way. Maybe atomization, I guess, maybe. Why did that happen? That's a very complicated question. There's a lot to touch into, and I really want to stress here. This is one factor. This is not every reason. This is not even necessarily the main reason. But this is a significant reason why feudalism ended. So we need to refresh ourselves again. I know I just said it, but it bears repeating. Feudalism did not end fast. There's places in Europe that continued feudalism up until I think 1990. I think one of the British islands in the Jersey, one of the Jersey Islands, had a actual feudal estate still running on it until I think the 1990s. But more broadly, if we look at just the country of Britain, feudalism as a social and economic structure was still a semi-relevant force up until World War I. I would not say it was the driving factor of the economy, and it wasn't the driving factor of the social economy, but the great estates and tenant farmers and tenant towns existed well into the 20th century. And it's really only the dual catastrophe that is World War I and then the Great Depression that destroy this. Finally. But at this point, it is in retrograde, and the aristocracy is no longer the preeminent force in society, and fewer people as a percentage of the population are working or living on a feudal estate. Now, the factor that really ends feudalism, at least with the caveat of earlier, one of the major factors is to be best described as the bourgeoisie, or if you want to use less Marxian terms, because I'm not really much of a Marxian historian, I don't particularly think it's a very good way to understand history, you could call them the merchants. Depends on your preference of terms. Now, this isn't, as I just alluded to, this is not a Marxian class war understanding. That's overly simplistic, and it's overly focused on economics. While economics are important, And our driving factor, as you will see here, it's not the direct result. It's several steps past economics that cause this to happen. So the first thing we need to understand here is the aristocracy, as a result of practicing the Noblesse Oblige and unrelated social pressures that the aristocracy has, they don't make as much money as merchants do. They have a much safer income. They have a much safer lifestyle. But merchants have more capacity to make money. And as technology such as better sailing inventions, financialization, and global trade really start going in the 16th, 17th centuries, this advantage really takes off. The risk for merchants decreases, the returns increase and speed up, and this really starts putting the merchants as richer than the aristocracy. If you look at the 17th century, the richest countries in Europe are the ones with the most merchants and the least aristocrats. Germany, France, Spain are poorer than Netherlands, England, Italy. This is a result of those three later regions being mercantile and the former three regions being more agrarian. There's a lot of reasons for that, but we will just take that as is. It's out of the scope of this video. Now, the merchant classes largely come from a different social class. The people who are merchants, some of them might be the second or third sons of the nobility, of the aristocracy, but most weren't. Many were the middle class in cities who have amassed just enough money to take the risk to do international trade. And as we get to later and later time periods, they start having money to invest in a factory or whatever. In large regards, this might be the top guildsmen branching out, if you will. The people who you might today call the upper middle class, prompting this, which is a very common trend in history. The upper middle class typically pushes out the traditional upper class, not necessarily by killing them or fighting them, but just the nature of the economy and society changes, putting more emphasis on them and less emphasis on the older style upper class. And in the mercantile revolution of about the 17th century, 18th century, the returns and profits to be made from trade blew far past what you could make through agrarianism. This directly led to the merchant class being the largest portion of the upper class, and as societies got more and more and more merchants relative to their aristocrats, because keep in mind, the aristocrats never disappeared. If you look at England, the aristocracy is still there. There's still the Duke of Edinburgh. There's still barons and counts and marquesses and whatever you want to, whatever titles that exist. Those people still exist. Those families still exist. The Habsburgs still exist. They never disappeared. But new money merchant families outnumber them. The old money, old wealth aristocracy is not dwindling. It's not disappearing. It might be merging into the new money merchant classes through marriage, but the old aristocracy never disappeared. This is one of the reasons why Marxian class war is just wrong. The old ruling class isn't defeated in a class war. It's not superseded. It's just slowly replaced because more rich people come from other places as the economy and as society changes. Though I'm oversimplifying that, so touch on that maybe later, but maybe not. Anyways. Now, why does this destroy or remove the Noblesse Oblige? Well, having come from a different social class, the merchants never got ingrained in them this value. It was a value of the nobility, a traditional value for hundreds and thousands of years that was never passed on to the merchants. You look at today and you look at all the worst excesses people might complain about, quote unquote, the billionaires or the millionaires or whatever. Most of the worst excesses are a result of failure or just ignorance that they actually need to fill out social obligations, that there is more to their station than just being rich. Now, there is another factor to this. The merchant classes, as a result of how they make money versus how the old style aristocracy made money, do have a qualitative difference in their relationship, which is one of the reasons they have yet to broadly adopt an equivalent or the same concept. That is the Noblesse Oblige. The feudal lord and tenant farmer relationship is one where you will have the same family rule the estate for generations, and you will have, in principle, the same farmers work on the estate for generations. Yes, I know there's more complications. This is a simplification. I understand how feudal economies work. If you want to attack me or comment in the comments how I'm oversimplifying feudal economy, feel free. It's out of the context of the video. Out of scope, I should say. The merchant classes don't have this relationship. The tenant farmer and the lord, those two families will have lived together, worked together for generations. In that circumstance, it's socially wrong to neglect something. If this person has been effectively your employee for 5 generations, this family, to hold them dry is more egregious than someone you've never met. It's one of the reasons the merchant classes never grew this. They never had a reason for this. Sorry, they had a reason. They never had the impetus for this. The first OG merchants made money through international trade. They would contract or own ships. They would get sailors. They would sail from point A to point B, buy cargo, and sail back. Sell their things. Make money. In this economic model, sailors are interchangeable. First off, basically modern medicine and pre-scurvy treatment, sailors had a very low life expectancy, especially grunt sailors. They would have a very, usually not particularly long career length. And they were often treated extremely poorly because they were very interchangeable. The skill of the grunt sailor was relatively easy to teach. And since they were only there for money, there was very little reason for the merchant to care. There is no generations of family interest. I just gave this guy money to do this job. There's nothing more than that to the interaction. Later on, once you get into the 18th, 19th centuries and you have factories and equivalent workspaces coming up, you get a very similar end result. To the capitalist who owns the steel mill, he will probably never meet or really know any of his workers, let alone knowing that his grandfather's grandfather's grandfather also had Bob's grandfather's grandfather's grandfather as a steelworker. You don't have this connection. They are interchangeable workers, and at the end of the day, if Bob leaves or dies, he can be replaced by Joe fairly easily. Whereas if Bob the farmer, whose family's been on the estate for 400 years, dies and is left childless, your tenant is gone. Yes, you can replace the tenant. You can get a new tenant. But this tenancy had been filled for decades, years, centuries. It's not the same. And it's very hard to understate this. Yes, as I said before, and I will say strongly again, not every noble lived up to this worldview. Not every noble lived up to their obligations. But those that did treated this extremely seriously. You don't just kick out your tenant. There had to be an extremely high cause. And even then, you might not do it. But as the aristocracy was supplanted by the merchant classes, the belief in, or the practice of the Noblesse Oblige decreased, and other social pressures and outcomes supplanted it. Was it for better or for worse? Hard to say. But this transition was not without conflict. Now, this is not to say this is the only cause, or even the principal cause. But one of the general causes of things like the Dutch Revolution, the English Civil War, the French Revolution, you could even argue the American Civil War. Sorry, the American Revolution. Or actually possibly the American Civil War too, but that's a bit out of scope of what I'm thinking. One of the causes of these is this conflict. Not direct, not overt, and not even first order, but the second, third order conflicts between old money aristocracy and new money merchants. Let us look at the Dutch Revolution, because it's the simplest and easiest one. The Spanish monarchy, which ruled the Netherlands, was built on traditional aristocracy, on agrarian land ownership focused wealth, mining, plantations, farming. The Dutch economy was built on international trade. The rules and laws that the Spanish monarchy was creating to better the Spanish monarchy, to uphold monarchical rule and traditional feudal systems. Though they was not seen that way at the time, but it goes one and the same. When you're looking at this with hindsight, you can assert this, though in the moment, that is not what you would That was not the rationale of the Spanish king. He was not thinking, oh, I must do this to uphold feudalism. But the actions he was taking would uphold feudalism. That is a direct consequence of these actions. Fighting wars to take over land, to expand the agrarian economy. This is very high level and oversimplified. That furthers feudalism. Much like how in the 19th century, the American South wanted to conquer places like Cuba to expand slavery to uphold the institution of slavery. Similar idea. The Dutch, as a mercantile trade-based economy, could not handle this. The wars, the taxes, the strife was bad for the economy, was bad for their business. If you are a traditional aristocrat with a feudal estate, as long as your estate hasn't been burned, the war doesn't really bother you. Your money's the same as it was going to be and what it was always going to be. The farmers farm, they plant crops. Those crops grow, you sell crops. If your money's made off of international trade, international war is very damaging. This is one of the ideas behind the neoliberal free trade thing. Like EU is this is really poorly described, but this is one of the ideas behind like the EU. If you have integrated economies with free trade between them, war becomes very difficult. It's really bad for business. The wars the Spanish monarchy fought were very bad for the Dutch. And then you also put some inflammatory things like the Reformation and the Dutch being Protestants and some massacres going on. I'm not discounting those. And this is why I said this is not the only cause, but it is one of the causes. When you look at any historical event, what I really want to stress upon you is there's not one cause. If you look at any event and you say, it was that one thing that did it, you're wrong. There might be one thing driving it, one thing that's really big, but it's not the only cause. In things like the Dutch Revolution, the disjoint difference between the mercantile, trade-based Netherlands and the aristocratic, feudal Spain was one of such driving factors. Would people have realized it at the time? Hard to say. We don't really know. Maybe if we look through enough primary sources, we could get a good view, but we might not have enough. They don't tend to exist. Documents that old don't tend to exist this well. Often get destroyed in wars or accidents. But it's not particularly important how they perceived it. These details affected it. But with that, I will wrap up the video here. By all means, if you like the video, like, share, subscribe. Comment below if you think that this format where I am just talking about the last video in my series, one detail about it in more detail. Let me know if you like that. I'm probably going to continue doing this regardless because I like it. Nothing else, honestly. Unless I get terrible views on this video, I suppose. Yes, that's kind of abandoned series or projects because no one watches them, but I mean, if no one watches them, does anyone really care that I abandoned them? But with that. Oh, one last thing I forgot to mention. I should have said at the top of the video. There is a live stream tonight as of the posting of this video. So Thursday the 18th, which is today. We will be on... I'm trying to do math here. I think it should be just before 8 Eastern time, 6 Mountain time, for those who are better up. It is the Alberta leadership debate. I'm 95% certain I have the ability to get the stream of it. I would be completely surprised. And we'll be discussing it. If I'm wrong and there is no stream, I don't know. I guess we'll just chat for a bit. I don't know. But I'm pretty sure they're streaming online. This is 2023. That'd be weird if they weren't. So with that, I bid you all adieu, and I will see you hopefully later tonight.